sound of gentle rain or soft ambient music fading in and out. Imagine, if you will, a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C., early in the 20th century. The air, though perhaps a bit thick with the summer heat or carrying the damp chill of an autumn day, held a certain stillness. Yet, beneath this surface calm, a profound struggle was unfolding, a battle waged not with swords or cannons, but with unwavering conviction and quiet endurance. It involved a group of women driven by a singular, unyielding purpose: to claim their rightful place as citizens, to exercise the fundamental right to vote. They were not shouting from rooftops, though their voices were clear. They were, in many ways, the silent sentinels of democracy, standing firm against a tide of entrenched resistance. Their story is not one of grand pronouncements on battlefields, but of silent vigils, of brave defiance in the face of indifference, and of the profound power of persistent, principled action. To truly understand the sacrifices made and the ground gained, we must first delve into the very heart of this movement, examining the women who chose an extraordinary path, a path that led them to the grim confines of prison cells and the silent, agonizing protest of hunger strikes. The fight for women's suffrage in the United States was a long and arduous journey, stretching back decades before the dramatic events we are about to explore. By the early 1910s, the movement had been active for over half a century, with women advocating for the right to vote through petitions, public speeches, legislative lobbying, and educational campaigns. Organizations like the National Woman Suffrage Association, founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1869, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, which merged with the NWSA in 1890 to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NOSA, had laid the groundwork. NOSA, under leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt, pursued a strategy of state-by-state campaigns and patient legislative efforts. However, a younger, more radical contingent of suffragists felt that this gradual approach was too slow and ineffective. Enter Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. These two women, both educated and deeply committed to the cause, had spent time in Great Britain, where they had witnessed and participated in the more militant tactics employed by the British suffragettes. They observed the effectiveness of public demonstrations, picketing, and civil disobedience in drawing attention to their cause and pressuring the government. Upon their return to the United States, they found the established suffrage movement, while well-meaning, to be somewhat staid and hesitant. Paul, in particular, possessed a strategic vision that blended American democratic ideals with a boldness that had been largely absent in the U.S. suffrage movement. In 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. This organization was distinct from NOSA in its singular focus on securing a federal suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution, believing this was a more direct and achievable path than lobbying individual states. Their initial major public action was the Women's Suffrage Procession, held on March 3, 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. This was a meticulously planned event designed to capture national attention. Thousands of women, dressed in white and carrying banners, marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. It was a spectacle of organized intent, intended to impress upon the new administration the widespread demand for suffrage. The procession, however, was met with unexpected and violent opposition. A crowd of onlookers, some hostile and resistant to the idea of women voting, surged into the street, creating a chaotic scene. Police present largely failed to control the crowds, and the marchers were subjected to taunts, physical harassment, and even violence. Despite the disorder, the procession was a success in terms of publicity. It thrust the suffrage movement into the national spotlight, highlighting both the passion of its advocates and the deeply ingrained opposition they faced. The injustice of the situation, where women peacefully protesting were attacked, generated sympathy and spurred further support for their cause. Following this initial surge of activity, the Congressional Union continued to evolve. In 1916, it merged with the Women's Political Union to become the National Woman's Party, NWP. The NWP adopted a more confrontational approach, drawing heavily on the tactics they had observed in Britain. Their primary objective remained the passage of a federal suffrage amendment. and they targeted President Wilson and the Democratic Party, which held power at the time, holding them responsible for the lack of progress. One of the most iconic and impactful campaigns initiated by the NWP was the picketing of the White House. Beginning on January 10, 1917, a group of women known as the Silent Sentinels began a daily vigil outside the White House gates. They stood there, regardless of the weather, the scorching heat of summer, the biting winds of winter, the pouring rain, holding banners with slogans that challenged President Wilson and the nation. Banners bore messages like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And "We are citizens of a democracy. Why are we disfranchised?" The Silent Sentinels were an extraordinary group of women, representing a diverse cross-section of society. There were educated professionals, artists, writers, working-class women, and women from prominent families. What united them was a profound belief in the principles of democracy and an unwavering commitment to achieving equal political rights. They understood that their visibility and persistence were crucial. By standing outside the symbol of American executive power, they aimed to shame President Wilson and his administration into action. Initially, their presence was largely ignored or met with mild curiosity. However, as the picketing continued day after day, week after week, and month after month, the mood began to shift. The United States had recently entered World War I in April 1917. The NWP's continued picketing, while peaceful, began to be seen by some as unpatriotic. How could these women be protesting their own government when the nation was at war, fighting for democracy abroad? This was precisely the kind of public pressure and criticism that President Wilson and his administration wished to avoid. The government's response to the Silent Sentinels escalated. In June 1917, under the pretense of protecting the wartime effort and maintaining public order, the police began arresting the picketers. The charges were often vague, such as obstructing traffic or unlawful assembly. These arrests marked a significant turning point. The NWP, under Alice Paul's leadership, made a strategic decision. They would not pay fines, nor would they accept bail. Their intention was to fill the prisons, to become political prisoners, and to highlight the injustice of their incarceration. The first significant wave of arrests occurred on June 22, 1917, when over 50 suffragists were arrested. They were taken to the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, a notorious facility known for its harsh conditions, and the DC jail. This was where the Silent Sentinels' commitment was truly tested. They were subjected to humiliating treatment, strip searches, rough handling, and meager rations. The jailers, often unsympathetic and hostile, treated them as common criminals rather than political protesters. Many of these women, who had lived comfortable lives, now found themselves in a brutal environment. Yet their resolve did not waver. Instead, they decided upon a new form of protest, one that would amplify their message and expose the hypocrisy of a government that claimed to champion democracy while imprisoning women for peacefully demanding their rights. They began a hunger strike. The hunger strike was a deliberate and agonizing strategy. It was a non-violent act designed to exert moral pressure and to force the authorities to confront the consequences of their actions. By refusing food, the suffragists aimed to appeal to the consciences of their captors and the public. They were willing to risk their health and even their lives to achieve their goal. The women who participated in these hunger strikes came from various backgrounds, but they shared a common courage and determination. Among them was Alice Paul herself. When arrested and incarcerated, she, along with others, began refusing food. The authorities, accustomed to dealing with common criminals who might refuse food out of defiance or despair, were unprepared for a coordinated, principled hunger strike by a group of educated women. The conditions in the Occoquan Workhouse and the DC jail were dire. The food was often spoiled, the facilities were unsanitary, and the guards were frequently abusive. For the suffragists, the hunger strike was a desperate measure, but it was also a powerful statement. As they weakened, their bodies began to fail, their skin grew sallow, their eyes hollowed, and their strength ebbed. The authorities, initially dismissive, found themselves in a moral quandary. The sight of these women, once vibrant and determined, slowly starving to death within prison walls, was a potent and deeply disturbing image. The public, who had been largely indifferent or even hostile, began to take notice. News of the hunger strikes started to filter out, carried by sympathetic lawyers, sympathetic guards, and eventually, through the press. The NWP worked tirelessly to disseminate information about the arrests and the hunger strikes. They employed every available channel to keep the public informed and to generate pressure on President Wilson. Their efforts were crucial in preventing the silent sentinels from becoming forgotten casualties of the suffrage movement. As the hunger strikes continued and the women's health deteriorated, the authorities became increasingly concerned. They feared the political fallout of allowing suffragists to die in prison. This led to a brutal and inhumane response. In an attempt to force-feed the hunger strikers, medical personnel, often under duress from prison officials, resorted to brutal methods. They would insert rubber tubes into the women's stomachs and force-feed them liquid nourishment, often causing severe pain, vomiting, and internal injuries. The most notorious case was that of Alice Paul. In November 1917, she was transferred to the psychiatric ward of the DC jail. The authorities, desperate to break her spirit and silence her protest, subjected her to even more severe treatment. She was confined to a padded cell. Her food intake was severely restricted, and when she continued her hunger strike, she was subjected to brutal force-feeding. This ordeal lasted for weeks, during which she was force-fed multiple times a day, often experiencing extreme pain and distress. She later described the experience as the most terrifying of her life. Other suffragists also endured the horrors of force-feeding. Women like Lucy Burns, Dora Lewis, and Annie Arnott suffered immensely. The physical and psychological toll was immense. Many suffered long-term health problems as a result of their imprisonment and the brutal force-feeding. Yet, their courage and their suffering were not in vain. The continued arrests, the harsh prison conditions, and especially the reports of the hunger strikes and the brutal force-feeding began to generate significant public sympathy and outrage. The hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while imprisoning women for demanding it at home became increasingly difficult for President Wilson and his administration to ignore. The NWP's persistent picketing, their willingness to be arrested, and their courageous hunger strikes had finally succeeded in forcing the issue into the national consciousness. The turning point came in late 1917 and early 1918. The publicity surrounding the mistreatment of the suffragists, particularly the hunger strikes, created an untenable situation for the Wilson administration. Public opinion was shifting, and the moral pressure was mounting. In January 1918, President Wilson announced his support for the federal suffrage amendment. While this was a significant victory, the fight was far from over. The amendment still had to pass both houses of Congress and then be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The NWP continued its pressure, understanding that public support and sustained advocacy were still necessary. The silent sentinels were gradually released from prison as the pressure mounted. Their suffering and their sacrifices had undeniably played a crucial role in shifting public opinion and influencing President Wilson's stance. They had demonstrated a level of courage and resilience that commanded respect, even from their opponents. The passage of the federal suffrage amendment through Congress was a complex and often contentious process. The 19th Amendment, which stated that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, was finally passed by the House of Representatives in January 1918, but it failed to pass the Senate. The NWP continued its campaign, using the same tactics of public pressure and moral suasion. Finally, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified by the necessary 3/4 of the states, officially becoming part of the U.S. Constitution. This monumental achievement was the culmination of decades of struggle, and the contributions of the silent sentinels, with their willingness to endure imprisonment and hunger strikes, were an indispensable part of that history. The legacy of the silent sentinels extends beyond the passage of the 19th Amendment. They demonstrated the power of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience as tools for social and political change. Their willingness to suffer for their beliefs inspired future generations of activists. They proved that even in the face of overwhelming opposition and brutal repression, persistent and principled action could lead to profound societal transformation. Their story is a testament to the fact that history is not always made by generals on battlefields or by presidents signing grand legislation. It is also made by ordinary individuals who, through extraordinary courage and unwavering commitment, stand up for their principles and refuse to be silenced. The silent sentinels were indeed silent in their peaceful vigil, but their message resonated loudly, and their sacrifices echoed through the corridors of power, ultimately paving the way for a more inclusive democracy. The journey of these women was not without its internal debates and disagreements within the broader suffrage movement. As mentioned earlier, NOSA, under Carrie Chapman Catt, pursued a strategy of state-by-state suffrage and working within established political channels. While this approach yielded significant successes, particularly in Western states, the NWP, under Alice Paul, believed a federal amendment was essential and that more confrontational tactics were necessary to achieve it. The NWP's strategy, while effective in generating publicity and pressure, was often criticized by more moderate suffragists for being too radical and potentially alienating potential allies. There were times when the NWP's actions were seen as undermining the more patient legislative work of NOSA. However, it is also true that the NWP's bold tactics created a sense of urgency and served as a constant reminder to the government of the unresolved issue of women's suffrage. Historians often note that the existence of both the more conventional and the more radical wings of the movement was, in a way, beneficial. The more moderate groups could point to the NWP as an example of what might happen if suffrage were not granted, while the NWP's actions kept the pressure on for a federal solution. The women who joined the Silent Sentinels knew the risks. They were aware that their actions could lead to arrest, imprisonment, and mistreatment. Many of them were educated women, accustomed to a certain level of societal respect. To be stripped of their dignity, confined in harsh conditions, and treated as criminals was a profound violation of their social standing, yet they willingly embraced this hardship. Their belief in the fundamental injustice of their disfranchisement was so strong that they were prepared to sacrifice their personal comfort, their reputations, and even their health for the cause. Consider the sheer logistical effort involved in maintaining the daily picketing of the White House for months on end. Volunteers had to be recruited, trained, and organized. Banners had to be created and maintained. Legal support had to be arranged for those who were arrested. Information had to be disseminated to the public and the press. Alice Paul was a master strategist, and her organizational skills were crucial to the success of the NWP's campaigns. The impact of the Silent Sentinels' hunger strikes was amplified by the NWP's concerted effort to publicize their plight. They enlisted sympathetic lawyers who could visit the imprisoned suffragists and report on their conditions. They held public meetings and rallies where accounts of the harsh treatment were shared. They distributed pamphlets and articles detailing the experiences of the women. This constant stream of information was vital in shaping public perception and maintaining pressure on the administration. The government's initial response was to try and dismiss the hunger strikers as simply being difficult or unruly prisoners. They attempted to portray the women's actions as defiance rather than principled protest. However, as the women weakened and the force-feeding became more brutal, the narrative began to shift. The image of women being force-fed, often violently, became a powerful indictment of the government's actions. It was difficult for the public to ignore the suffering of women who were clearly willing to endure such hardship for a political cause. The role of the press was complex. Some newspapers were highly critical of the suffragists, echoing the government's narrative and labeling them as unpatriotic or disruptive. However, other newspapers, particularly those that were more sympathetic to the suffrage cause, provided extensive coverage of the arrests and the hunger strikes, bringing the issue to a wider audience. The NWP actively cultivated relationships with journalists and provided them with information, helping to ensure that their story was told. The international context of World War I also played a significant role. President Wilson was acutely aware of the United States' image on the world stage. Fighting a war for democracy abroad while denying basic democratic rights to women at home presented a stark contradiction that was difficult to reconcile. The NWP exploited this contradiction relentlessly in their messaging. The passage of the 19th Amendment was not the end of the struggle for full political equality for all women. Women of color, in particular, continued to face significant barriers to voting for decades to come due to Jim Crow laws and other discriminatory practices. However, the 19th Amendment was a monumental step forward, and the Silent Sentinels played an indispensable role in achieving it. Their story serves as a powerful reminder of the courage and resilience required to challenge injustice and to demand fundamental rights. The women who participated in the Silent Sentinels campaigns were not seeking mere recognition. They were seeking a fundamental restructuring of power and a realization of the democratic ideals that the United States proclaimed. Their patience with the slow pace of change had worn thin. They understood that sometimes, in the pursuit of justice, one must be willing to step outside the conventional boundaries of protest and to embrace methods that, while difficult, are powerful in their moral clarity. The systematic nature of their arrests and imprisonment was a deliberate tactic by the authorities, aiming to overwhelm the NWP and to discourage further protests. By constantly arresting the picketers, the government hoped to deplete the NWP's resources and to break the spirit of its members. However, the NWP's commitment to not paying fines and to accepting prison sentences meant that this tactic backfired. It created a continuous stream of political prisoners, each case serving as another opportunity to publicize the cause and to highlight the government's repressive actions. The conditions at the Occoquan workhouse, in particular, were well documented by the NWP. Reports described overcrowded cells, inadequate sanitation, insufficient food, and physical abuse by guards. This environment was designed to be demoralizing and to break the spirits of the inmates. For women who were unaccustomed to such hardship, it was a deeply harrowing experience. When the suffragists began their hunger strikes, the authorities were faced with a dilemma. They could ignore the hunger strikes, risking the death of prisoners and the resulting public outcry. Or they could intervene, which meant resorting to the deeply unappealing and morally questionable practice of force feeding. The latter option, while enacted, proved to be a public relations disaster for the government. The story of the Silent Sentinels is a powerful illustration of how ordinary citizens, through extraordinary bravery and strategic action, can effect profound change. They were not professional politicians or wealthy influencers. They were individuals who believed in the promise of democracy and were willing to endure significant personal suffering to make that promise a reality for themselves and for future generations. The details of the force feeding are stark and disturbing. Medical personnel would often use a nasal tube or a mouth gag, inserting a rubber tube down the throat or nose into the stomach. This process was often painful, leading to gagging, vomiting, and damage to the nasal passages and throat. The liquid nourishment, often a mixture of milk, eggs, and other nutrients, would be poured through the tube. The women would resist as much as they could, but ultimately, the force of the authorities usually prevailed. The psychological impact of this experience, coupled with the physical pain, was immense. It is important to reiterate the calm, unhurried nature of their actions. The picketing itself was a silent, visual protest. The banners spoke volumes, but the women stood in quiet dignity. Even in their hunger strike, their protest was a silent one, a refusal to participate in a system they deemed unjust. The noise, the drama, and the violence were often on the side of their oppressors. This contrast between their quiet resolve and the external turmoil is a key element of their powerful message. The success of the NWP was also rooted in its ability to create a compelling narrative. They framed their struggle not just as a fight for women's rights, but as a fight for the very soul of American democracy. They argued that a nation that denied half its population the right to vote could not truly call itself a democracy. This framing resonated with many Americans who were proud of their nation's democratic ideals. The years between 1917 and 1920 were a period of intense political maneuvering and sustained advocacy. While the Silent Sentinels' imprisonment and hunger strikes were pivotal moments, the work of lobbying, public education, and grassroots organizing continued. The NWP understood that passing a constitutional amendment required not only public pressure, but also the votes of elected officials. The final ratification of the 19th Amendment was a hard-won victory. It required securing the support of 36 states, and the process was fraught with political challenges and close votes. The role of suffragists at the state level, organizing campaigns, lobbying legislators, and educating voters, was as critical as the national efforts. The story of the Silent Sentinels is a reminder that progress is rarely linear or easy. It is often achieved through the persistent efforts of individuals who are willing to take risks and to endure hardship for the sake of a just cause. Their quiet dignity in the face of adversity, their unwavering commitment to their principles, and their willingness to sacrifice their well-being for the right to vote left an indelible mark on American history. They were, truly, the Silent Sentinels who helped secure a more perfect union. The echoes of their struggle can be felt even today as we continue to grapple with issues of equality and representation. Their courage serves as an inspiration to those who believe that every voice deserves to be heard, and every citizen deserves to participate fully in the democratic process. The meticulous detail of their efforts, the quiet strength they exhibited, and the profound impact of their perseverance are all part of a rich and enduring historical tapestry. The unhurried unfolding of their story, from silent vigils to the chambers of Congress, is a testament to the power of sustained and principled action in the pursuit of fundamental rights. Their legacy is not one of fleeting protest, but of enduring change, etched into the very foundation of American citizenship. The quiet determination of these women, their resolve to stand and endure, remains a powerful and deeply significant chapter in the ongoing narrative of democracy and equality, a story worth remembering, worth understanding, and worth carrying forward.